What is historical criticism? Well, in regards to the New Testament, historical and criticism are a combination of two words that are unfortunately oftentimes misunderstood. When people think of the word history, they usually refer to things that happened in the past. But the word history actually comes from the Greek word histor, which means eyewitness. So if we're going to claim something is historical, what we're saying is that there were people there to see it, and that we can trust the people who saw it to have reported it accurately. Now, in order to know whether anything was done accurately or not, you need to be able to test it, which is where the term criticism comes in. Once again, criticism is generally seen, especially among the internet, to only refer to pointing out flaws, but that, again, is not entirely true. Criticism does involve pointing out weaknesses, but it also points out strengths. So if I'm going to use the word historical criticism, what I'm looking for and what the definition is looking for and comparing the eyewitness testimonies, thus the word history, to find strengths and weaknesses in their claims. Say, for example, if I were to critically examine the claim that there were bombers in the modern sense, say an F-22 Raptor in World War II taking place at D-Day, well, I would examine that and find out a key weakness. The F-22 Raptor was not invented until a very long time after 1940. So that would be what we would call an anachronism, and they would critically examine that as a false historical claim. Wouldn't dismiss the concept of D-Day, but it would dismiss that detail. So in historical criticism and applying that to the New Testament, we need to make sure we define our terms. How are we going to be testing the history of the New Testament to see if it's history at all, or what parts are history and what parts are fantasy? And in this, we will use three standards. First, the standard, and the strictest, by the way, known as multiple attestation. How many people were saying the same basic things about the same event? And by the way, noting this is the most strict standard that you could apply to anything, especially in ancient history, if you have a minimum of two sources, you are as sure as you can be about anything historical. If you have two different people in independent platforms and backgrounds that are saying the same basic thing about the same basic event, the death of Jesus of Nazareth, for example, I will not only be giving you two, but we'll be going over seven. The principle of embarrassment is another one. When historians are looking for details about an individual to know whether or not they existed, they generally look for things they wouldn't have made up or embellished. If anything else, it made them look bad, because anyone can build up their hero to be larger than life. It takes a honest, in fact, a too honest report to level someone down to reality. And this is why if someone finds an embarrassing detail, which by their own cultural standards would discredit them in the eyes of their viewers, it counts for double points in a sense of speaking, because they wouldn't have made that stuff up if they wanted to. And on the other hand as well, if you have enemies admitting things about you, that counts for more as well. This would be embarrassing details as well. If your enemies acknowledge your flaws, that proves even more that you existed, because if you had an enemy of a cause or an individual that didn't exist, they wouldn't have talked about you, let alone have acknowledged some of your strengths or weaknesses. Then finally, contemporary work. How close to the originals were these events reported? Now note, we can trust accounts given for World War II, noting the example, written 50 to 60 years after the fact, and no one will bat an eye. But if, on the other hand, people are going to say, look at all of our records of ancient history, with the exception of the New Testament, of course, and realize a very common trend of not discovering even pieces of these writings that would reference, say, Homer's Iliad or Suetonius's historical records in the Greek culture, or say, for example, Tacitus and the Romans, we don't find these things until 800 to 900 years after the events themselves took place. And yet no one would dare question the veracity of these things historically. We can test them through archaeology and through looking at other sources. But for some reason, people, when it comes to the New Testament, don't apply those standards and say, oh, no, this can't be admitted. Well, we're not going to be inconsistent. We want to apply these standards fairly. So, starting with multiple attestation, where else do we see the basic elements in the New Testament mentioned in other places? Where can we know for certain there are, in fact, some historical facts at play here? Well, when it comes to the New Testament, it all centers around the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And while the resurrection of Jesus Christ certainly is the focus of the New Testament exclusively, on top of the early church fathers, of course, which you can examine in our textual criticism reports, the individuals that mention Jesus' death actually give us two things, because if you died, that probably meant you were born at some point. And if you have people who weren't even believers in you that acknowledge your death, then that gives us beyond all certainty, or rather within all certainty, absolute certainty, in fact, that you in fact existed. So for those who are dealing with Jesus mythers like Richard Carrier and his acolytes, remember these core details. First of all, we have the report of Thallus, who is a Samaritan, a Christian, by the way, but note the explanation before you come to conclusions. He reported that Jerusalem went dark during Jesus' execution. Now, we don't have Thallus' writings, but we do have one of his enemies. His name was Julius Africanus, and in his Record of History, Volume 3, he explained away Thallus' report that when Jerusalem went dark during Jesus' execution, as the Gospel of Matthew reports, he explains it in that there was a solar eclipse happening at the time. Now, for those of you who remember, Jesus was executed during Passover, which was the first full moon of the Jewish month of Nisan. That meant, not the car, by the way. Now, that meant that if the first full moon of the month determined when they would celebrate this Passover's festival, well, that would mean that the earth, the sun, and the moon were forming a 90-degree angle. The moon was facing the earth, and in this specific direction would appear to this area of the stratosphere at the time. And then likewise, the sun would have had to have been at that angle. If he's going to claim there was a solar eclipse during Jesus' execution, then A, there wouldn't have been a full moon, but B, he was claiming that the moon would have been in two separate places at the same time. It would have been both between the earth and the sun and at a 90-degree angle between the earth and the sun. But before you dismiss Julius Africanus as just making a factual error and saying, well, he can't be trusted as history, he actually confirms something very important for us as Christians and as people who are trying to figure out whether or not the Bible is historical, Christian or not. He admitted that Jerusalem went dark. He admitted that Jesus was executed. He just got the facts wrong as to why. But we aren't asking why. We just want to know what happened. And he admitted something that we now have two sources from, both in Thallus that he references and within his own report, which he got wrong in explaining away. The second one, and this is the one you'll find the most commonly referenced, is Tacitus, who was a Roman historian. He lived at the better half of the beginning of the 2nd century, and he reported that Jesus was executed as a criminal during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. This is in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44. Now, this not only backs up the time frame that Luke reports, but also gives us the dating system in which Tiberius would have been reigning and this execution was reported. It also backs up as well the time in which people were being crucified still in Jerusalem, not going later into the 2nd and 3rd centuries when it was outlawed. Even the Romans lost the taste for it. The third is the Talmud, which are the writings of the Pharisees. No, not the Torah, which is the Old Testament, and generally referring to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is the writings of the rabbis, the traditional leaders. And in Talmud Sanhedrin, verse 67, they report that Jesus was executed by the Romans. They also have their own opinions as to who Jesus was and why. But understand, we're not looking to the Talmud to figure out who Jesus was. We just want to know what happened in history. And if the writings of the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, specifically, the people who put Jesus to death, at least acknowledge his historical existence, I think we have a case. But it doesn't end there. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian that worked for the Roman Empire, reported that Jesus was executed during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. He wrote this in Antiquities, section 18, section 3. Note the chapters and verses. We'll just note that 18 and 3 in that structure and order. But on top of the written sources and noting these people who weren't even necessarily Christians, note Thallus was our reference, but we're quoting Julius Africanus to figure out not only if he existed, but if his claim for Jesus being executed was valid. As an enemy of Christianity, he acknowledged that historical detail. We also have three pieces of archaeology, multiple attestation, different sources, independent sources, that would report and support these sort of things. And if we want to prove something was in fact happening at this time in history, say for crucifixion, you would ask, do we have other examples, perhaps remains of people who were also crucified at this time, and how could we tell? Well, if you go to the Jerusalem Museum today, you'll find the crucified heel bone of a man by the name of Yochanan, and he still had the nail of crucifixion embedded into his heel bone. When they buried him, note that detail as well, they couldn't remove the nail, so they simply left it in. And that gave them two conclusions to draw from. Not only does this heel bone date to around the same time as Jesus, it was within 50 years granted, but in this time frame, within the first century, Romans were still crucifying Jews as a form of capital punishment and allowed them to be given a proper burial. All four of these details are claims that the Gospels make, and you would wonder, if Jesus was the only one who was given this sort of treatment, we might want to ask a few questions. But we can dig up the bones and remains of this man and find out that he wasn't. That there was a lot of Jewish individuals at this time, and one has even survived all of these centuries, in fact 2 millennia, to support this account. The second piece of archaeology in the realm of multiple attestation is in fact a very major discovery, also in the Jerusalem Museum. They have the tomb of Caiaphas on display. He was one of the individuals, his father-in-law Annas also played a role in this, but he was the representative of the Roman government as far as the Pharisees were concerned, and his family as well as his own tomb and his estate. They archaeologically dug up and found the remains of this guy's house in Jerusalem and available for display today. So we have the individuals that were setting up, or at least one major player in particular, that set up Jesus' execution. And noting that he died within the first century, the dates are starting to check out. If Caiaphas was in fact the one who ordered Jesus to be crucified, by the authority of Pontius Pilate, or rather coerced him into it, then they would in fact have to put their money where their mouth was. But guess what? The check cashed. Caiaphas was in fact living at this time. They did find out he not only existed and his family estate and his family's remains, but specifically referencing this tomb and Caiaphas, we know he not only existed, but that the reports and the authority that was given to him do in fact match up with the prestige he would have had in that day after examining his home. Also, the tablet that was discovered off of the coast of Caesarea was a piece that was actually reused as a stepping stone during the Crusader era. But when they were taking this thing apart to examine the stones that were being used, they found out that this stone wasn't during the 10th century or even all the way to the 14th century. It was a 1st century tablet. around the same time as Jesus. And interestingly enough, on the tablet there was an inscription, and it turned out to be a dedication stone. It was a little tablet to announce to people that this little placard was dedicated to this very famous individual and by this very influential world leader. It mentions two individuals, Pontius Pilate and Emperor Tiberius, both not only living at the same time, but dated to the same time as Jesus. So, with all of these examples of multiple attestation, and noting that you only need two independent sources, we don't even need the Gospels, and we have over 3 times the amount of evidence that would make us as sure as anything ever could be that Jesus was in fact a historical person. The Gospels were reporting things about people, places, and things that did exist in fact at the time they claim they did, and that his death is as attestable and supported as any other event in ancient history. But that's not the only standard we're going to apply to the to the New Testament. On top of the multiple attestation, the people, places, and things that would back up what the New Testament says about Jesus, there are also things we look for regarding principles of embarrassment. What details are admitted in the New Testament that according to their own cultural standards, no, not ours, theirs, that wouldn't have been made up? The answer is plenty. I'll give you 5. First, the original eyewitnesses of the resurrection, according to the Gospels, are all women. And according to other sources we have at this time, they wrote, noting the writings of the Talmud and the Pharisees, they said that let the words of the law be burned rather than given to a woman. The traditional Jewish prayer in the mornings of Jews living in the first century in particular said, Lord God, I thank you that I was not born a slave, a Gentile, or a woman. Women weren't allowed to give testimony in court by Jewish cultural standards. Note, Romans and Greeks had their own rules, but the Gospels were written by Jews to Jews. And if you wonder for a second and ask, well, if they were making all of this up, why would they say that the women were the first eyewitnesses? In fact, why would they make the disciples not only secondary to the women as far as the resurrection is concerned, kind of an important event for Christianity, but even more so make themselves out to be bumbling idiots and cowards compared to them who believed him when they saw him? Now, note, that's another interesting detail, because on top of the women, whose testimony the entire resurrection based on initially, note, we have over 500 documented eyewitnesses after that point, but going off of that principle of embarrassment, the guys had to admit the girls saw Jesus before they did. The girls believed Jesus rose from the dead like he told them a dozen times before they did. That's embarrassing by first century Jewish standards. Not 21st century American standards, but this isn't a 21st century American book, now is it? Now, continuing on, the original disciples didn't believe Jesus had written, even after they admitted in the Gospels that he told them how it would happen, when it would happen, and why it would happen, before it had even happened. And they still didn't believe. Even after they saw him in person, after his public death several times, they had to admit that some doubted. Now, what kind of person would make up this stuff to try and build themselves up when it only ended up tearing them down? They had to admit these details because they were simply the facts. And note this as well. They abandoned him in fear when he was arrested. Before even the crucifixion take place, they didn't even have the gusto to stand up for the person they believed was the Messiah. Now, anyone could cover up that detail and say, oh yeah, we were commanded by Jesus to leave. Or even better, when Peter cut the ear, no, he cut the head off of one of those servants, and Jesus stopped him and said, no, I can prevent this. No, it didn't even mention that Peter even got a clean hit. It says all he managed to do was his ear, and he gets reprimanded by Jesus as a result. He's saying, permit even this, put your sword away, Peter. All of these things are embarrassing details and things that they had to admit rather than what would have been embellished. This is the thing that historians look for if they're being objective. The third example of embarrassment is that the original leader of the church, not Peter, but Jesus' biological half-brother, James, who, note this as well, grew up with the guy, didn't believe that he was God until after his resurrection, which makes sense when you think about it, because if your big brother Joshua, that would be the English equivalent, started claiming and demonstrating through words and deeds that he was God, what would it take to convince you that that was in fact the case? A resurrection from the dead would be a start. But note this as well. When we see James before the Gospels, he thought his brother was insane. On several occasions, both in Matthew and in Luke, he's going out of his way, as per even his mother's requests, to get Jesus out of the crowds and back home because they thought he was beside himself. That word is literally, they are talking to themselves, they're crazy. So when you put these pieces together and ask, why would the leader of the early church make himself out before the life of Jesus to be someone who didn't even believe in him, but after become one of the most vital and influential people in the Christian church? To have power over the people. He was thrown off of a several-story high building, clubbed to death, and resulted in some brutal treatment at the hands of his fellow Jews. And also note this as well. He pretty much committed himself to a life of poverty at this state, according to the book of Acts. They had no money, they had no women, and they had no influence to gain over these people other than the fact that they were simply reporting what they had seen and heard. Now here's the thing. When you ask, what about the individuals that propagated this message? What about, say, for example, the Apostle Paul? Well, he actually doubles down on this report as well as a hostile witness to Christianity, because Paul, as you know, before he became a Christian, was the Pharisee Saul, who was so passionately against the Christian message that he went out of his way to hunt down and murder Christians. In fact, the moment of his conversion, he was on his way to a nearby city called Damascus, which is in Syria, a whole other county in the Roman province, and a whole other country in the modern day, in order to bring those Christians back to Jerusalem who were fleeing his persecution in Jerusalem for trial and execution. But then something happened that made him realize, oh, Jesus has risen from the dead. He is the Messiah. I was wrong. Now you tell me, what has to happen for a man, let alone a man of great prestige, wealth, and influence, to completely throw that all away and subject himself to a life of neglect, torture, and loss, and eventually getting beheaded in the city of Rome by Emperor Nero when they were made out to be the scapegoat of his insane and debauched tendencies? Saul the Pharisee is another example of embarrassment. He admitted that he used to murder Christians, and now was being used by the Lord to write a third of the New Testament. Continuing on with that point. Oh, and note, he was also a witness to the first martyr, the deacon Stephen, who was stoned to death as per the Pharisees' orders, of which he was a member. Finally, the most well-known apostle, Peter, is called Satan by Jesus, and denies ever knowing him 3 times when a little girl challenges him about it. Now you think if they were embellishing these things, even in a moment of weakness, if they were making this stuff up, they would have made someone a little bit burlier than a little girl asking him, "Aren't you one of his followers?" And he started to swear and say, "I don't know the man." It continues on from there, but these are just a few examples of the sort of things historians would note and say they weren't embellishing these things because they're embarrassing themselves. And note that these standards for testing history didn't exist until the time of Napoleon Bonaparte. If they were trying to set up this account in their favor, apparently they were 16th to 17th centuries too early. Finally, contemporary work. Were the people who recorded the events close to or know those who witnessed the actual events? Because the word history means eyewitness, right? The answer is we have more contemporary work to support the New Testament than any other documented record in ancient history. I'll give you 5. First of all, Matthew and John were direct eyewitnesses to the testimonies that they wrote, Matthew of which wrote within the lifetimes of the other eyewitnesses who could check and double check his work. Mark and Luke interviewed eyewitnesses, and noting Mark was the disciple of the Apostle Peter, he got his account from him. Luke was able to not only clarify historically everything that Matthew reported, this is what he makes his account out to be in the first chapter, but even more significantly is that when he clarifies certain details, say for example about Jesus' birth, where would he get the information about how Mary was feeling or what she sang to the Lord after she visited her cousin Elizabeth, who currently was pregnant with John the Baptist and would be his forerunner by 6 months? Where would he get all these details? Well, who would know more about giving birth to the baby than Mom, who was still alive at this time, by the way? In fact, modern historians, Sir William Ramsay to name one, considered Luke a historian of the first rank by modern standards. So noting that these reports are in fact to be taken seriously in the realm of academia, and internet memes not going to undo that. Continuing on, the earliest creed, which is a short statement, the study of these things is called doxology, where before they had the ability to mass produce Bibles, before the printing press, before scribes could copy this information and distribute it without fear of persecution, torture, and death, and on it went, they had to pass this information around in short and easily memorizable lyric sheets, essentially. And as they would quote these phrases to each other, it would essentially make up their beliefs. And this would be their Bibles before they had the ability all to have their own. And this is also important because a lot of those creeds, in fact, several dozen, according to the last counting, are quoted in the letters of Paul, Peter, James, and the others. And so when you look at these creeds, you're looking at essentially what the Bible was before the New Testament. The Old Testament obviously formed the foundation for the Jewish aspect of things, and they definitely had access to that through the Septuagint. But you wonder, okay, what did the Christians believe? Do we have any written records of those? Well, as recorded in the Gospels and tested even by atheist and liberal scholars, the earliest one we have on record is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, where Paul reports, hey, this isn't mine, I received this, and I'm passing it on to you. And according to these liberal atheist scholars, James E.Z. Dunn, John Dominic Crossan, Bart Ehrman, and others, they would date this to within months of the first Easter. Now, there's nothing like that in ancient history anywhere, because at most 2 years, the earliest we have of a report of anything other than the New Testament that would support even the most basic of details would date to within around 700 years after the fact. And they have no problem teaching that in school. But this, oh no, we can't teach that. It's too supported. But in that creed, if you want to read it sometime, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, we have a very straightforward approach to what Christians acknowledged as historical fact. Jesus died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. He was buried, and he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures. He was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, then by over 500 brethren at one time, then by James, then by all the apostles, and then Paul notes in verse 8, parenthetically, wasn't a part of the original creed, but he said, then he was seen by me also, as one born out of due time. So the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus was supported not only by witnesses that weren't looking for him. The guy denied him 3 days earlier. People who had rejected and abandoned him like cowards, according to their own reports, and over 500 people at one time, majority of which I'm sure would have made up his disciples before John chapter 6. All admitted under pain of death. In fact, a lot of them had died for their faith at the point that Paul reports that doxology, and this is interesting as well. When this creed is reported, he says the majority of them have fallen asleep, but some remain to this day. Here's the thing. As these people are dying, and dying for what they claimed and believed, not only persecuted by their fellow countrymen, but starting to gain the ire of the Roman Empire as well for not bowing down to and obeying their gods, you have to ask the question, why would they die for something they would know is a lie? Because that's key. You can die for a lie, but you have to believe it's true. You can be deceived, you can be convinced, but these were the original eyewitnesses. These were people who would know whether or not Jesus died. They didn't just take Peter's word for it. He wasn't looking for Jesus. He didn't believe that Jesus had risen until multiple appearances in person. But continuing on from that point as well, if this creed reports over 500 people at one time, that's not a hallucination. One person hallucinates, it's essentially them having a dream while their eyes are open, REM movement, rapid eye movement. But then you wonder, I had a great dream. Hey, everyone, if you're subscribed to this channel, when you go to sleep tonight, let's all have the same dream together. We can have like a Google Dream State hangout. That's not how that works. You have two people who even have a remotely similar dream. You've created essentially a bigger miracle than the resurrection itself. That's not according to me. That's according to even skeptical psychologists. But note this as well. Continuing on from the early creeds of Christianity and this being reported, the individuals who give us these dates to within months of the first Easter aren't Christians. They don't believe in the resurrection, but they acknowledge that this was something that they believed within months of the actual event. Whatever they saw, it was what they were reporting. And it lines up with the Gospels today. They don't conclude that it's true, but they have to acknowledge history or they lose their degrees. Finally, actually I think we can fit in two more. The letters of Paul date before the Gospels, 2 Timothy being the exception, of course. That was before his execution, and the Gospels of Matthew and Mark were likely in circulation at this time, maybe Luke as well. But Paul's letters date before the Gospels, and note that Peter himself directly affirms them as Scripture in 2 Peter chapter 3. And the other apostles as well would stand to gain from dismissing him because he was such a controversial figure, and yet they're in our Bibles for that reason. They were recognized by the original eyewitnesses of Jesus under the same standards as any other prophet of God, which we will also examine in a future study, that they do in fact bear not just the penmanship of Paul the Apostle, but specifically the inspiration and preservation due to those words as being the Word of God. And finally, the geographical details given in Acts by Luke are giving us the sort of information that is almost borderline unnecessary. For example, he notes trade routes that were in fact in circulation in the first century. Water depths they measured off the coast of the Roman Isles when the storm Euroclydon, which was a slang term at that time for when tropical storms hit, the names of specific titles and leaders like governor, proconsul, and others that fit into their exclusive time frames in which the gospel reports these things, all of which were accurate. These are the sort of things that came from eyewitnesses who not only knew what they were talking about, but if you were to say, well, they just got lucky, then you have given and granted them odds that are beyond even the most strict and narrow lottery odds. It would be simply unreasonable to dismiss the New Testament as history, and yet people do it. Why? Because they don't know the facts. They don't know what to do with the facts, or they don't like the facts. But I want to make sure that all of you are equipped with these things. So note that by any fair standard that we would apply to any other record in ancient history, we can conclude that the New Testament is honest history. And if that is in fact the case, then what do you do about its reports? Well, for those of you that have received them, I want to thank you for your time listening to this study, and I hope that it is put to good use. And for those of you that haven't, I hope that you think about this information and ask sincere questions about what exactly the implications are of these things. Sincere questions are always welcome. You don't have to be a Christian to ask. But note as well, if you want to know more, or perhaps want to know these things in more detail, get them from the sources themselves, feel free to ask and I'll be happy to do so. I want to thank you for your time. I want to remind you that Jesus loves you and that he has demonstrated that in a moment of history. Next time we'll be discussing the alleged mistakes in the Bible, and I hope to see you all then, because you're going to be surprised to find out Well, I'll just leave it for then. But once again, thank you for your time, and God bless you.